Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for part 2 of our Teagasc Virtual Sheep Conference. My name is Damian Costello, Teagasc Sheep Specialist based in Athenry, and the format for this evening's webinar will be similar to the first part of our conference on Tuesday evening. We again have 2 papers to present to you, which hopefully you will find both interesting and informative. During the talks, can I encourage you to pose any questions you may have using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. I will put your questions to the speakers during the Q&A session at the end. So let's meet our speakers. First, can I introduce our guest UK speaker, Ben Shrugnal. Ben is a graduate of the Royal School of Veterinary Studies, Edinburgh. Since then, he has worked in a number of roles, including working in a mixed veterinary practice. In recent years, he provides a carcass-based post-mortem diagnostic service to farmers and their vets, and that's based in the northeast of England. Ben, you're very welcome, and we look forward to hearing from you in a little while. We are also delighted to be joined by my Teagasc colleague, Dr. Áine O'Brien. Having qualified with a Bachelor of Agricultural Science from UCD, Áine went on to complete her PhD on Genetics and Genomics for performance in a multi-breed Irish sheep population with the University of Limerick. Áine is currently working as a Teagasc Post-doctoral Researcher on Sheep Genetics and Genomics. The topic you are covering, I think, will strike a chord with all sheep farmers, Áine: reducing labour at lambing, improving lamb vigour and ewe mothering ability through breeding. So over to you, Áine.
Thank you, Damian. Yeah, so as Damian mentioned, the topic of my presentation is looking at some of these traits to see if we can breed for improved lamb vigour or for improved ewe mothering ability, and all in an effort to try and reduce that labour requirement at lambing. Especially, I'm sure a lot of people are in the middle of lambing now, but it's definitely the most labour intensive time of our year. So if we just quickly look at some of the Irish breeding indexes and what we have already. So we all know that we have 2 indexes here in Ireland. We have a replacement index and we have a terminal index. And I've just put a collection of photos here up on this slide just to kind of represent the types of traits that are represented in each of those indexes. So in both indexes, we have carcass traits. So we have things like carcass fat, carcass conformation. We also have some lambing traits, so traits like lamb difficulty, lamb survival. And we also now have the health index. So we have lameness and DAG score in there. And that's kind of it then for the terminal index. You'll see on the replacement index along the top that I have 2 additional photos in there. And that's just to represent some of the maternal specific traits that we have in the replacement index. So they are traits like the number of lambs born and the ewe mature weight, which are understandably not included in the terminal index. I suppose to remember, it's important to remember then as well that the aim of the replacement index, you know, with all these traits included in it, is to try and produce a ewe that is a good mother. She's got really good capabilities, but she's still able to produce a lamb that can be, you know, fatten quickly and reaches slaughter at an early age. And then, you know, the terminal index is to do what I just mentioned there, is to just breed these lambs that we can that are ready for slaughter at an early age. So if we then look at some of how the indexes are broken down, and you'll see I have kind of pie charts for the replacement on the left and for the terminal on the right. And I have the colours matching to the different types of traits that I mentioned earlier. So if we look at the purple first, so that represents the production traits. So as I mentioned, you know, growth and carcass traits, carcass fat, carcass conformation. And you can see that it makes up a huge amount of the terminal index, about 62-63%, but it only represents maybe 25-26% then in the replacement index. I suppose the next most representative traits within both of the indexes then is lambing, and that's in the blue colour. So you can see that, you know, lambing has a much more it nearly has a bigger emphasis there in the terminal index, because of course, no matter what kind of index we're looking at, we still want lambs that are born live and that have very little lambing difficulty. I suppose the next little sliver I'll talk about is the little section in green, and those are our health traits. So as I mentioned, we have DAG and lameness in there. And then the big chunk then on the replacement index is in pink is those maternal traits. So of course there's a really big emphasis on those maternal traits in the replacement index at about 46%. And we all know how important they are. And these are things like the number of lambs born. So I suppose I'm talking here about traits that are already in those indexes. But I suppose if we look at how those traits came to be in the indexes, when we start, analyzing traits or looking at different traits, we can't just decide that, yes, that's a trait we want, we're going to put it straight into the breeding goal. There are a few things that we have to consider. So for any trait, we have to have a think about it and make sure that they fulfill some key criteria. So they need to be socially or economically important. So whether that's in terms of on-farm profit, whether it's in terms of animal welfare, consumer perception is so important at the moment, whether it's in terms of farmer welfare even. So the second thing is that the trait must exhibit genetic variation. Of course, if there's no genetic variation, it means that we can't breed for it. It's fixed and that we can try improve or disimprove it. And the third thing is that the traits that we bring into these breeding indexes are easily measurable on a large scale. So, like things like weaning weight is quite easily to measure on a large scale. And I suppose not only do we want lots of records, but we also want lots of records over time. So we want these records to be coming in year on year so that we can continually produce, accurate breeding values and that, our estimations are as accurate as we can. So once a trait fulfills all three of these criteria, then we can introduce it into the breeding goal, and we can start, making breeding decisions based on that trait. So I suppose this is just a graph of the labour requirement at lambing, and we're all so aware of it already. And you can see that from January to December throughout the year, the labour requirement changes. But of course, for a March lambing flock, which is what this is based on, you can see there's a huge spike. So there's almost 25% of all of the labour required throughout a sheep farming year required just specifically at lambing. And look, it's something we're all aware of, but I suppose when you see it in a picture form, it really just shows that, how much of an increase in labour is required at lambing. And that 25% is more than the labour required at housing, weaning and mating combined. So I suppose when we look at the traits like lamb vigour or young mothering ability, we're trying to reduce this labour requirement as much for, the economic cost of labour, but also for the stress placed on the farmer at a really already stressful time of the year. So you might just have to go with me with this for a second, because in my personal opinion, and you're more than welcome to disagree with it, my favourite ewes are the ewes that I want to keep daughters from are the ewes that I don't tend to remember. So when I walk out into the field at home after lambing, 2 or 3 weeks afterwards, there are certain ewes I'll remember. So, I'll remember the one that I was lambing for ages in the middle of the night, or I'll remember the one who had mastitis. So like that, like you might pick out a ewe here who, she had a treble and, you were up in and out of that pen, a couple of times a day trying to get those 3 lambs to drink. You might remember this one for a completely different reason. Maybe she had a single, she had a really, really tough lambing and she was sluggish afterwards. But you might not remember the ewe that's here at the front. So, she's in the field, she has her 2 lambs. So she must have lambed down herself. The lambs must have gotten up and drank themselves. She must have just gone through the system and kind of, for all the world, landed outside in the field. And look, in my opinion, these are the kind of ewes you want during a lambing season. So then we look at the traits, and the first of those is lamb vigour. So lamb vigour is scored based on the time taken for the lamb to stand after birth. It's scored on a 5-point scale where 1 is very poor and 5 is very good. So, those lambs that are still not standing after 60 minutes would get a score of 1 for very poor lamb vigour. And we know how important it is for a lamb to stand up and suckle quickly. We know how important colostrum is. And so that's why, for those lambs that are up and standing within 5 minutes, they get a score of 5, which is very good. And obviously they're the kind of lambs that we like to see. Again, young mothering ability is also scored on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 is very poor and 5 is very good. Ewe mothering ability is scored based on the attentive behaviour of the ewe towards her lambs. So you know where that ewe is licking the lambs and taking care of them. And then just a little bit more context for what the scores mean. So a ewe that gets a score of 1, which is very poor, is that she has no interest in her lambs. She doesn't even want to look at them. She doesn't want to take any notice of them. Whereas a ewe that gets a score of 5 is a ewe that's really, really attentive. You know, she licks those lambs quickly. She's very protective over them. She's stamping her feet. She's very attentive. She's encouraging them to drink. She follows them closely if you want to move them to an individual pen, and she's bleating for them. So she's got those vocal cues to try and encourage the lamb as well. So when we look at some of the data that we included here in our study, we had both flock book recorded and commercial crossbred data from Sheep Ireland. So it's not all pedigree data, it's not all commercial data, it's in around half and half. I suppose the other thing to mention here is that all the data that we had, all the records we had, are based on animals that were lambed indoors. So we don't have any data on animals that were lambed out of doors. So we can't really make, you know, assumptions or guesses based on the data. We can have a good guess, of course, but we can't really say anything concrete. So if we then just look at the prevalence of each score, and you can see I've just added the little descriptions here. So 1 again for both traits is very poor, 5 is very good. And if you look at the last 2 lines, so the score of 4 and 5, you can see that the majority of animals recorded for these traits fall within those good or very good categories. You know, for lamb vigor, there's only about 4% of lambs that are you know, in that 1 and 2 category. For mothering ability, there's only about 3% of the animals recorded in that 1 and 2 category. So for the most part, from the data we have, you know, the majority of animals are landing within those good and very good categories. So this is a sire prevalence graph, and it's just to demonstrate the differences in the prevalence of poor lamb vigor among different sires. So in this particular graph, I've categorized poor lamb vigor as a score of 1, 2, or 3, meaning that the lamb takes at least 30 minutes to stand. And 30 minutes, in my opinion anyway, is quite a long time for a lamb to be lying down after birth and not being able to stand. And it's the kind of lambs that I'd nearly be, you know, jumping in to try and get them up and trying to get them to suckle. So within the graph here, we have 309 sires represented, and these sires make up all different breeds. I haven't paid much attention to what the different breeds are. Each of the sires then have at least 30 progeny, and these progeny were born in at least 2 different flocks. And by kind of bringing in the criteria that the progeny have to be born in at least 2 different flocks, it kind of removes some of those management and those environmental effects. So we can kind of see that it's more so maybe due to the genetics of the sire, and the genetics of the sire is responsible for a lot of the differences. So if I just pick out the 2 extremes, you can see on the left-hand side there, you know, there's 14 sires where none of their lambs had a poor lamb vigor score. So all of their lambs were up, standing, seeking to suckle really quickly after birth. And then on the opposite side of that, you have, you know, a couple of sires there, but where between 65 and 90% of their lambs were still lying down at 30 minutes after birth. And as I said, I think that's quite a long time. So I've just picked out a couple of different sires here, just to show, you know, the differences that we can see. So sire 1 here has got 75 progeny. Those progeny were scored for lamb vigor in 3 different flocks, and all of them were standing within 30 minutes. So like it, you know, there is a big difference between sires. Again, if we look at the opposite side of that, you can see that we have another ram here where he had 40 progeny and born in 2 different flocks, but only 10% of his progeny were standing within 30 minutes. So that's, in my opinion anyway, that's a lot of lambs to be still lying down after 30 minutes. And you know, they're the ones where you're spending time hopping into the pen, maybe trying to get them up. And it's extra time that you don't necessarily need to be spending on those lambs. And then these are the same kind of graphs for ewe mothering ability. So again, poor ewe mothering ability where the score is 1, 2, or 3. So these are the ewes that are kind of bothered about their lambs, not overly bothered, right down to the ewes that have absolutely no interest. So there's 150 sires represented in here, and each of those sires had 30 daughters, and those daughters were lambing down in at least 2 flocks. So again, like poor lamb vigor, by ensuring that the sires are represented in more than one flock, it means that you're kind of removing some of those management and those environmental factors. So then along the bottom of the graph is the prevalence of poor mothering ability, and up along the side is the number of sires. So again, like there's some extremes. Now it's not as variable as the lamb vigor graph, but you can see that there's a huge difference in the the differences between sires. So you have one sire on the left hand side, for example, where there's none of his daughters are showing any poor mothering ability, and then on the other side you have a sire where 60% of his daughters are showing a poor mothering ability. And again, I'm just picking out a couple of different sires. So, for example, here, this sire had 36 daughters. Those daughters lambed down in one of 2 flocks, and all of them had a good or very good yo mothering score. And again, if you bring it back to my thing about these are the yos that I don't remember, these daughters were just lambing down, getting up, licking the lamb straight away, trying to get the lamb to stand, and doing all the things she should be doing. On the other side of that, which of course we love to show a few, stark differences, there was another sire and he had 34 daughters. These daughters were lambing down in 5 different flocks, and 60% of his daughters had a poor mothering ability score. So again, these are those yos you might have to spend extra time on encouraging them, putting a bit of salt in the lamb or whatever to try and get the yo to show more interest. So then I suppose from a genetics perspective, we want to see, how much genetic variation is within these traits, and we want to estimate a heritability. So, for us, the amount of heritability is the amount of variation seen in the trait that's due to the genetics of the animal. So an example I'm going to use here is birth weight. So if we think about birth weight, there's certain things that are due to the genetics of the lamb. The lamb can't feed itself. It's obviously getting a lot of nutrition from the mother. So some of the growth and some of the birth weight of the lamb is due to genetics. And what we say is that the heritability is based on the animal's own genetics. And we deem that the direct heritability. So the direct heritability is just on the animal's own genetics. So the animal is responsible for it. But we know with birth weight, as I said, the lamb hasn't had the opportunity to feed itself essentially, or to gain its own food. So the yo is hugely responsible for a large proportion of the birth weight as well. And so that's where we look at the heritability based on the dam's genetics. And that's what we term maternal heritability, when it's just the influence of the dam's genetics on the birth weight. Now, of course, there are a couple of other things that might influence the birth weight. For example, this lamb here was single, so it wasn't competing for nutrition or anything. So that obviously influences birth weight a little bit as well. So again, just to recall, direct heritability is due to the animal's own genetics. Maternal heritability is just due to the dam's genetics. So if we look then at yo mothering ability had a direct heritability of 6%, meaning that 6% of the differences that we see between different yos is just due to genetics. And again, with lamb vigor, as with many kind of early life traits, we had both a direct heritability and a maternal heritability. So the direct heritability for lamb vigor was 40%, which is actually quite high for such a trait. And then again, the maternal heritability, so the amount of differences within lamb vigor that is just due to the genetics of the dam, was about 5%. So I suppose there's a huge difference in direct heritability between yo mothering ability and lamb vigor at 6 and 40% respectively. And I suppose when you think about it, we might be able to make some improvements a little bit quicker with lamb vigor because of the higher heritability, but nevertheless we can make huge differences in both traits just by selecting animals that have got better breeding values for either trait. So this is this is a slide that I showed you quickly earlier, and it's just to point out that we need to make sure that we're ticking off all of these criteria when we're investigating a novel trait before we introduce it into a breeding goal. So I suppose Then if we just go through them individually, the first thing I've put here is that we want to make sure that young mothering ability and lamb vigour are both socially or economically important. So I would go on the side that they're actually important in both regards. So in terms of economics, they're important with if you're getting these animals that you can spend a little bit less time with because they're good mothers or the lambs are getting up quickly, then you might be able to reduce your labour bills. From a social perspective, we all know that lambing is a really stressful time of the year. When you have these problem ewes, they are really, really stressful, and they take a bit out of you. So I think from a social perspective, it's also really important to think about these in terms of farmer welfare and farmer burnout, especially at lambing. So I think we can safely say that both traits fulfill this criteria. The next thing to look at is if the traits exhibit genetic variation. So for both traits, I've shown you the differences in sire prevalence for, poor lamb vigor or poor mothering ability. And we can see that there's huge differences between sires. I also showed you that, both of the traits are heritable, so that, some of the differences we see are due to the genetics of the animal or the dam. So we can also tick this to say that yes, both traits fulfill this criteria, they both exhibit genetic variation. And the final thing is if this trait is easily measurable on a large scale. And I suppose this is can be shown from evidence from the records that we have so far. So we have nearly 22,000 mothering ability records. We have almost 45,000 lamb vigor records. So we're able to measure this quite easily. We don't really need any additional equipment. We're doing it by eye essentially. So I think that we can absolutely say that yes, both traits are easily measurable on a large scale. And because all of these criteria have been fulfilled, we can now look at introducing both of these traits into the breeding goal, and we can start producing breeding values for them. So Damian, this is my final slide, and I'll hand back over to you.
Thanks. Thanks, Áine. Excellent presentation. I think a figure that struck me was that 25% of the annual labour is around the lambing period. So I suppose if breeding can reduce this workload, it would be most welcome. So we will give you a breather. Can I remind people that you can submit your questions using the Q&A function, and we will have questions and answers for both speakers after Ben's presentation. So Ben's presentation will focus on research he has carried out on laryngeal chondritis, a condition that affects the upper respiratory tract of sheep. So Ben, if I could get you to share your screen with us, and over to you, Ben.
Thank you for having me. It's nice to be here. The subject of my talk is Texel laryngeal chondritis, something which some of you will be familiar with, having seen it for real. And to briefly introduce myself, as Mr. Chairman said earlier on, I run a carcass-based post-mortem service at a large fawn and stock collection centre in the northeast of England. And the aim of the job is to make it easy for you guys, for farmers, to get a post-mortem done when you need one, and for the results to be reported back quickly with minimal padding and waffle, so that you can do something quickly that you need to do to stop further losses. The enterprise started in 2014 with some levy board funding in response to the closure of various regional labs in other parts of England. So the advantages of the system is that you don't have to travel to deliver the carcass. I can stack them high and sell them cheap because I have larger numbers of carcasses, and I can turn things around quickly because we aren't usually waiting for lots of further testing to confirm diagnoses, although we do sometimes do further testing. It's a high throughput system, and here are the sort of numbers that I do in 4 years worth. I do lambs and sheep and cattle, because that's mainly what are the livestock makeup of the area of England that I work in. And so roughly I've done about 8,000 carcasses since we started in 2014. Some years ago, I had a student working with me, and it became clear that laryngeal chondritis, as in Texel throat as in people have various terms for it, was emerging as a pretty common cause of death in sheep of the Texel breed. Mainly, it has to be said, in tups, but also to a lesser extent in ewes and even in lambs that were of the Texel and Beltex breeds. Now, what I see is when I open up these sheep, I take the first look at their lungs and their larynx, and I just basically see what you can see here on the screen, that you cannot see through the airway. Here's the epiglottis, and here is where you should lead to the windpipe down here, but you can see it's completely blocked by swelling on either side. And there is swelling here and swelling here, so the air just cannot get through into the lungs past this swollen larynx. And when I put my knife through these larynxes, what I see is of various stages of development of the disease. Sometimes you just see little projections or little knobbly bits on the side of the larynx going into the windpipe here, and these two sort of protrude into the airways to stop air getting through down into the lungs. That's quite a mild case there. And here is a slightly more advanced case where you can see the knobbles are bigger there, and that knobble there is slightly bigger there. That's one way it can look. Then the disease can progress so that these knobbles either side of the windpipe can be a bit bigger, and they become infected and smelly and horrible, and you get pus and things on them. And all that pus and all that swelling means that the airway is even more blocked and air can't get through. And eventually what happens to these sheep is that they die because of suffocation. Now, what you'll see when you see these sheep is firstly a sheep that struggles to breathe, and it's, you know, heaving and its sides are coming in and out. They also sometimes make a noise, so you can hear a noise because of this airflow, turbulent airflow at the top. So they make an upper respiratory noise. But reasonably commonly, and especially in the summer, you just find them dead. A good, well-grown, often youngish Texel tup or ewe, you just find it dead, and on post-mortem examination, the reason it's dead is because it couldn't breathe, because you've got these projections on either side of the larynx that are stopping air getting into the windpipe. Another complication that can happen after the initial infection of these two knobbly bits here is that the infection can get in under the surface of the lining of the larynx, and the infection can work its way into these two joints, this one here and this one here, so that you get pus and bacteria starting to proliferate in those two joints. Sometimes it can be soupy and liquid like this, or sometimes it can be more like custardy, cheesy, like this and like this. And what those joints do is they enable movement of those projection-y bits, and having an infection in those two joints stops the movement of those two joints, so that the folds, the joints or the vocal cords, as you might say, cannot move out of the way, so that in that way the airway becomes obstructed again, the sheep suffocates and often dies. Now, this is another version of the same thing, where these lesions are a little bit older, and sometimes the sheep can live for days and weeks with this infection developing before they actually die. And the lungs themselves, and generally speaking, all the other parts of the carcass, generally there's nothing to see in them. The lesions are purely confined to the upper airway and the larynx. Now, I had a quick look through my numbers. In the interval between 2014 and 2019, I looked at around about 170 rams of all breeds. I should say, for statistical correctness, that most of the rams that I end up on my table probably are Texels, because Texels are a very popular breed around here, and rightly so, for all the beneficial traits that they have in terms of carcass growth and etc. etc. But of all breeds, laryngeal chondritis was the commonest cause of death of all tups of all breeds, albeit Texels are overrepresented in the denominator. They were definitely overrepresented in the numerator. So that to us said, I wonder what's causing this problem. Is there anything else we can do about it to reduce the incidence? And most importantly, are there things that we can identify for people who are breeding Texel rams and who are using Texel rams? Are there any risk factors that we can identify so that you can be sure that a ram that you're buying is less likely to die of this condition. I should say that I'll come on to that later. So what we decided to do was we took some larynxes from blue-faced Leicester sheep and from Texel sheep, and decided to compare the two to see were there any differences in the anatomy and the shape and the function of those larynxes that might explain why Texels appear to be more prone to laryngeal chondritis, Texel throat than blue-faced Leicesters do. So this is what we did. We every day we get a big pile of sheep delivered at the yard. We decided to collect, this is over a period of 3-4 months, we decided to collect 23, we collected 23 larynxes from Texel rams and 20 larynxes from blue-faced Leicester rams. The reason we chose blue-faced Leicester rams was because they're about as far away from a Texel as you can get, as in they're tall, they've got a long face, and they're sort of thinner rather than Texels, which are broad and short and have a sort of short face and short neck. We made some measurements, things like neck length and head length and girth and height, that sort of thing, from the carcasses themselves. And then we just removed the larynxes, put them into formalin so that we could make some measurements later on when we got them back to the lab. We made no attempt to determine what the cause of death was in each of those cases. We just took them randomly off the pile. And here are a list of measurements that we made. No need to go into too much detail. It's just to say that we made a lot of detailed measurements to try to determine what were the risk factors that might make the Texel larynx more prone to getting Texel throat than the blue-faced Leicester larynx. Sure enough, when we collated all the results together, we did find that laryngeal some of the Texel larynxes that we happened to have chosen at random did have full-blown laryngeal chondritis, and in some cases that was definitely the cause of death, and in some cases there were subclinical lesions, as in lesions that weren't the cause of death but were there anyway and sooner or later might have led to Texel throat, and those lesions were more common in the Texel breed than they were in the blue-faced Leicester breed. And the most important findings were that the Texel larynx was significantly shorter in length and height when compared to the blue-faced Leicester. So it's a smaller larynx for a similar weight of sheep. It was significantly wider in important areas than in the controls. And importantly, the vocal cords, those bits in the middle that I showed you earlier on, the bits that sort of protrude into the airway, into the windpipe like a pair of curtains, were significantly closer together in the Texel and significantly more likely to be touching in the Texel. Another important finding was that the shape, the overall shape of the Texel larynx was much more like a funnel, so wide, going quickly into a narrow tube and then coming down into the lungs in the windpipe. In the Texel, more like a funnel shape, whereas in the blue-faced Leicester, the arrangement was a lot smoother and a lot more just like a cylindrical tube, which we hypothesized, or which we guessed or surmised, might make the turbulence of the airflow, therefore the trauma to the lining of the trachea, much more significant in the Texel than it would in the blue-faced Leicester. And went from there to say, well, I wonder if that's part of the reason why Texels get Texel throat and blue-faced Leicesters don't. The other interesting thing is that the width of the windpipe was significantly narrower in the Texels than it was in the blue-faced Leicesters. So there are some measurements that we could go on to make the case that some of those some of the shape and some of the measurements in the Texel are the reason why the Texel gets Texel throat more commonly than the blue-faced Leicester does. That was study number 1. Study number 2 was basically a pooling of observations from another syndrome seen in Texel and Beltex sheep, where we were finding that we were finding a combination of different lesions in some of these sheep, which were either found dead or found just about dead and then very shortly after dead. And the lesions that we were seeing was the diaphragm, which separates the trachea, the thorax, where the lungs and the heart sit, from the abdomen, where all the guts and liver and all those sort of things sit, was rupturing. And so the guts were ending up not in the abdomen where they should have been, but in the thorax where they shouldn't have been. Sometimes this was at the same time as this, we were getting massive thoracic or abdominal hemorrhage, which you can see in this picture here. Here's a set of lungs, and here's the hemorrhage associated with the tearing of the diaphragm. Sometimes we got black leg of the diaphragm muscles, or the muscles that were close to it, and sometimes we got an arterial aneurysm at the same time. An aneurysm being a thinning and thinning and thinning of the wall of an artery, which eventually one day just bursts, and serious large amounts of hemorrhage, and a one-way trip to the Fallen Stock Collection Centre where I work. Some, but not all, of these sheep had also had Texel throat lesions, which may or may not have been part of the cause of the hemorrhage and the diaphragmatic ruptures and hernias. Now, just some pictures. It's a bit difficult to get your head around, but here is the diaphragm, right, separating the chest contents from the abdominal contents. Here is the hole in the diaphragm here. Here is the fat in the abdomen, and here are some guts just plopping their way through into the chest where they shouldn't be. Here again is the same thing. This side is the chest. This is the abomasum here. This is the diaphragm here. This is the rest of the abdominal contents where they should be. And there's the spleen, there's the rumen. This is a better side-on view. So I've opened up the chest from the side here, laid the sheep on its side. Here is the spleen, here's the rumen, here's the abomasum, here is the diaphragm, whose job is to separate the two together. Here is the ribs, which I've knocked back and opened. Here is the abomasum in the chest where it shouldn't be. And here is an enormous amount of hemorrhage. And here you can just about see a bit of lung there, and a bit of lung there, and a bit of lung there. But you can see how the lungs are pushed to the side by this abomasum here, which shouldn't be there. And so you can see how the sheep is going to get squashed lungs and is going to suffocate. Here's another picture of the same thing. There's the diaphragm flopped forward. There's the abomasum in the chest cavity, and there's the ribs opened up, and there is a large amount of hemorrhage, which is probably the ultimate cause of death. Here is a set of lungs from a Texel sheep, and here you can see a large amount of hemorrhage within the middle of the chest, what they call the mediastinum, in the middle of the chest. This blood vessel here has undergone, we think, an aneurysm, which, as I say, is a thinning and a thinning and a thinning of the wall until one day, boom, it explodes and you die. That's that. Now, the interesting thing about this was when we looked at the diaphragms under the microscope, you can see that it isn't a sudden rupture, as in if you run into a wall or something, or have a fight or something like that, where it just bursts and that's the end of you. Actually, there's a historic tearing and repairing and tearing and repairing of these of the muscle of the diaphragm. So there's something underlying. There's some stresses in the past that this diaphragm has been exposed to, which eventually it's given up and it's bust. Now the question is, why have those stresses been applied? There are two theories, really. You have to have these theories to be able to disprove them or prove them. It could be that because there is narrowing of the windpipe, and because the larynxes are quite narrow, and because there are projections into the hole in the larynx and it's narrow, it could be that means that the forces in the chest are so strong, and the barrel-chested Texels, it doesn't help either, that the diaphragm just cannot cope with all those forces and gives up. Or it could be that the underlying tissues, the muscles, there's something wrong with the underlying tissues that make up the diaphragm, and they don't knit together properly because of some underlying genetic problem. Similar to Marfan's disease, or similar to Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which are two diseases of the sort of connective tissue that makes up muscles and cartilage and other things. This is one of the reasons why I think that there is maybe some mileage in searching for a genetic test for possibly for both syndromes. So, to summarize the results of both studies, we found that there are some features of the Texel larynx which do predispose it to laryngeal chondritis, as in the closeness together of the curtains that shut across the windpipe when the animal breathes, and the funnel shape of the larynx itself and the narrowness of the trachea. We did set out to find some external measurements in Texels which would enable us to predict whether or not certain individuals are going to suffer from Texel throat, but we failed to find any. I personally had reservations that we would find any, because I'm not sure that particularly narrow, short-faced or short-necked or stocky Texels, I don't think you can look at a Texel from the outside and predict whether or not it's going to die of laryngeal chondritis, and we didn't find any obvious external features to predict it, but you know, I didn't think we would, but our numbers were small anyway, so we might not have. And in the second study, we do see these diaphragmatic ruptures, etc. And could the two be linked, or is there an underlying problem which might link the two? So the pathogenesis, how things happen, I think the initial reason for Texel throat happening is because the curtains close together, they clash together, a bit like an opera singer with nodules. You get damage to the lining of the two curtains which open and close. That lets bacteria in. As the bacteria get in, you get an inflammatory response which makes swelling, and as you get swelling, that's a very bad place to have swelling because you've got very little spare space. The swelling gets bigger and bigger and bigger until eventually the swelling just closes up the airway at that level, and you die of suffocation, or possibly because of the pressures that puts in the chest, the diaphragm gives up and busts. And whether or not there is also an underlying connective tissue disorder or a disorder which makes those tissues something wrong with how the internal structure of them is a hypothesis at this stage, but I think worth pursuing. So where would you go from here? Firstly, we should say that it's a very researched area for various reasons which we could debate later. If I was wanting to know how do I reduce the incidence of Texel throat in Texels, I would pursue 3 forms of imaging. I would have a go at sticking an endoscope down to see if I could assess the degree of how close together are these vocal folds. I would have a go with an ultrasound probe to see if I could make some of those measurements we were making in dead sheep in live sheep, and see if I could use those and follow those sheep where I'd made those measurements in to see did they die later of Texel throat. And I would thirdly incorporate some measures of the windpipe diameter and some of those measures of the larynx, if I could, while we were on with the CT scanner measuring breathing tups for muscle depth and fat depth and all those sorts of things that terminal sire tups get measured for anyway. That would be one area of research to pursue. The other way I would suggest that it might be fruitful to pursue a genetic basis of the condition, as in collect lots and lots of samples from sheep that have died of Texel throat and do a screen for likely genes in those, and collect a load of other controls from sheep that hadn't died of Texel throat and see what the differences are and identify some candidate genes and throw them. So that eventually one day we could do a test for, you know, this sheep may be prone to developing Texel throat later on in its life. But I think that's probably a 5-year, 10-year plan, at least at this stage. These are the acknowledgements, because Katie, my student friend, did all the laryngeal dissection, all that detailed work. Here are various people who funded the study, and I thank you for listening. Look forward to the discussion, and pass the microphone back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thanks very much, Ben. Excellent presentation also. I suppose maybe just before we get into some questions, there's a comment, I suppose, more than a question, that has come in here from the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine Small Ruminant Group. And maybe, Ben, I might just put the comment to you and maybe ask you to comment afterwards. So just to read the comment, research work on laryngeal chondritis has recently been conducted in Ireland. This condition has been reported in sheep, horses and cattle. In the case of sheep, a predisposition of the Texel breed is suggested, although the condition occurs in a number of breeds. This published research work, including cooperation between the Irish Texel Society, UCD, the Department of Agriculture's regional veterinary laboratories, and Teagasc, have identified links between throat conformation and the disease. And it's similar, they say, to the work conducted by yourself, Ben, and Katie Wayne in the UK. So also here, future research is planned involving the Irish Texel Society, UCD, and the regional vet labs, trying to use ultrasound to identify sheep at risk of developing clinical disease, and will begin as soon as COVID-19 restrictions are lifted. So Ben, maybe you would like to comment on that.
Yes, we've collaborated with the Irish group and cited their research, and we've all shared our findings. And I think the plan would be the next steps will be to work together to try and get some funding probably for a 1 PhD person who can work on all those various work streams that I've talked about earlier on, the 3 imaging possibilities, the ultrasound, which Marissa and her colleagues are already planning to do, the endoscopy, to stick a probe down and see what predictions you can make by what measurements you can make, and CT scanning, at the same time as trying to find the genetic root of the problem and see if there are any genes associated with it. The caveat to that one being that there probably isn't one gene, there's probably quite a few genes, and it's probably a fairly complicated genetic inheritance, but that genetics now has never been better and never been cheaper, so that isn't a reason not to pursue a genetic cause. But the 2 things need to happen at the same time, and the plan certainly is to work together to do it.
Yeah, okay, and again, it's important to acknowledge the research work that's ongoing, I suppose, on this side of the water.
Absolutely.
And also the, I suppose, the proactive approach by the parties mentioned in tackling the condition. So there's lots of questions. So I'll ask yourself, Ben, and Áine, to keep your answers as concise as possible to the viewers. If there's any questions that we don't get to in the time, we'll endeavour to answer them and put the responses on our website. That's, I suppose, provided we have your email address and your name and so on. Just maybe one more for you, Ben, and I might move over to Áine then. There's a couple of people have asked similar type questions, Liam and Maria. In terms of a suggested treatment for sheep with laryngeal chondritis, do you have any advice?
Well, you're really asking the wrong person, because it's a bit late for my patients for treatment, but my guess would be penicillin for a long time. I have talked to people who've tried tracheostomies, which tell me they haven't worked very well at all, but I would think long-term penicillin, possibly with steroids, but
okay.
I don't know.
Okay. Áine, maybe I'll give Ben a little break for a second there, and if I could come to you, there's similar type questions from both Seamus and Stuart. They're asking, do you think that health is underrepresented in the indices, or I suppose should health have a greater value or weighting, as it may affect the longevity of the O?
Yeah, so I suppose the health index is still quite new. It only came in kind of 2017, 2018. And I suppose we're trying to build on the records we have and everything, so that we can place more emphasis on it in the future. I suppose the thing with the health traits, so we've got like lameness and DAG score. With something like lameness, we want to be careful that we don't double count within the indexes. So for example, if the growth rate is reduced because a lamb is lame, for example, that information is already going to be accounted for in age at slaughter or carcass confirmation or something like that. So we want to be careful that we don't double count within the index either.
Okay, very good. And just another follow on maybe from that. If maternal index is producing everything you want in a yo and you have a yo and that's doing what you want, and you have a lamb that finishes early and within spec and so on, why are we concerned, I suppose, about the terminal index as such at all?
Yeah, I suppose we here in Ireland anyway, we're quite focused on terminal breeds as it is. So the terminal index, you're not always going to be wanting to, for example, keep the replacement daughters from certain ewes. So we can use the terminal index to make sure that the progeny from the ewes that we don't want to keep those replacements from are finishing quickly and are sent to slaughter. So I can see why you might say that, but I still do think that there is a kind of a niche for that terminal index there as well.
Okay, very good. And I suppose we all know that replacement costs are high in sheep. Is there any work being done on your longevity and lifetime profitability? And is there things like culling age and that kind of thing that we can feed into the index?
Yeah, so there's work going on at the moment. I think Noreen is doing some of it. There was Teagasc were involved with a study that was produced recently, looking at some of the factors that might affect ewe longevity. And some things that came back from that were that mastitis was one of the biggest reasons for culling here in Ireland. But also some of the early life traits had effect on the kind of productability of the ewe herself. So they found that ewes that were singletons actually lambed for the first time at a later age. So I suppose they're yet to kind of dive into that more to look at the reason why that is. But yeah, there's work ongoing at the moment.
Okay, very good. And just, I'll give you a little break after this, but just a question from Graham, and I'm very much, I suppose, paraphrasing. What about outdoor lambing flocks? Are the traits the same?
So as I mentioned in the presentation, we don't have any information on the outdoor lambing flocks. And when I look at some of the previous studies that have taken place with where they looked at lamb vigor and mothering ability, they were also indoor lambing flocks. I haven't seen kind of studies where they looked explicitly at outdoor lambings, except perhaps one that was in New Zealand a couple of years ago, where they didn't look at the ewe mothering ability herself. They looked at how long the ewe spent at the birth site. So how quickly she was able to kind of round up her lambs and go. So the traits that we're looking at are defined differently. I imagine that they will be, we could make some predictions on based on our data for outdoor lambing, but we just don't have any data to back that up ourselves yet.
Okay, very good. I might come back to yourself, Ben. Just, I suppose, in terms, I suppose this is more, it's a comment as well, I suppose, that has came in from Sheep Ireland, and I'm not sure, Ben, if you're familiar with the work that Sheep Ireland do, but briefly, they collect ram performance data and provide genetic evaluations, and their responsibility is to increase the rate of genetic gain in the Irish sheep sector. So just what they're saying is Sheep Ireland has also been working with the Texel Society on this topic. They have developed a straightforward way for breeders, and this is all breeds. It's obviously not Texel, as we've already said. The condition does affect all breeds. To record laryngeal chondritis cases via the health recording screen on the Sheep Ireland website or through the Sheep Ireland app. So breeders that log laryngeal chondritis cases, these are contributing valuable information.
Oh, absolutely.
And the research, for research into its cause can be undertaken and potentially maybe lead to predicting which bloodlines are most likely to be affected by the condition. Would you concur with that, or would you agree?
Well, absolutely. And I think the last thing that anybody would want to do is try to discourage people from reporting, and for people who do report it to be penalised in any way. You know what I mean? That's got to be the way forward. To not least because if you have cases, then you can volunteer those cases for the imaging methods that we were talking about earlier on.
Yeah, and do you know if the UK Texel Society are recording? They are.
I don't know if they're recording, but they have a database which lists causes of death, and one of those is laryngeal chondritis, but it isn't used by everybody, and the data isn't as well populated as it could be. But so yeah, they are trying to, and I must say we've had conversations with them, and they've been very proactive and very keen to be constructive about the issue and get to the bottom of it.
Okay, okay. Just, I suppose there's a question in there from Flora, again, to paraphrase. Would you feel that sheep with a narrower head sheep and longer necks, are you fairly confident that these type of sheep are less prone to the condition?
Well, other breeds probably, but within the breed, I'm not sure you can tell that necessarily we haven't enough. You'd think it would be the case that a narrower, longer, taller Texel would be less likely to get it, but the data doesn't exist to prove that.
Okay, okay, okay. So you don't have any definite data on that. And I suppose a question from Willie: is it possible that other underlying conditions or diseases, that if an animal has other underlying conditions or diseases, that it makes them more susceptible to laryngeal chondritis?
All I can tell you is that the sheep that end up on my table dead with laryngeal chondritis have no other gross lesions in any other organ. So probably not, I don't think.
Okay, okay, okay. Okay. Okay, we might just go back to yourself, Áine. So there's a question in, Áine, from Mark. Would you recommend aggressive culling of rams that are producing lambs that are of poor vigor or have a poor score for vigor?
So look, I think it depends on kind of your breeding goals. I suppose when it comes to lamb vigor, it's not the be all and end all. At the same time, you also want to take into consideration, like, some other traits, like, growth traits or whatever, or like anything like that. But I suppose if you're looking at your different rams and you're, for example, seeing that the progeny from one ram aren't performing as good as another, and the lamb vigor is also a factor, then yes, absolutely. I'm not sure, like, personally, if I would cull a ram strictly dependent on lamb vigor. I think you have to try and take into consideration some of the other traits as well. From like our perspective, look, all I can say is that I did cull a ewe last year for mothering ability because she lambed as a first timer, and she was a terrible mother, and I said I would give her another chance, but she was at the same crack then when she lambed a second time, and we just decided to cull her because she was taking up too much of our time and the lambs are falling behind.
Okay, and just a couple of quick ones then as well for you. Do you feel that there is a learned, James asked the question, is there a learned element to mothering ability? So I suppose the question, another way to put the question, does your age affect mothering ability?
Yeah, so there does seem to be some kind of a learned aspect to it, and that, yeah, the mothering ability would increase as the ewe ages. But if you still look at some of the first time mothers, then again, you can see that there still is a big difference. There can be some ewes that take to it very quickly, and some others that just don't. So yeah, there is definitely a learned behavior to it.
Okay, and Robert also asks, in terms of a commercial setting, how would you recommend that a commercial farmer would record traits like lamb vigor and mothering ability, or have you any tips for them on that?
Yeah, so look, I can speak off my own experience, and I use like the voice recording function on my phone if I'm in the shed at night. If I'm there during the day, I put it into the Sheep Ireland app. Sheep Ireland, you can log into their app and record everything there. We also have some like whiteboards on the pens for ewes so that we can jot it down quickly. But I think it's definitely possible. From the lamb vigor side of it, it's much more of a timed thing. So you're seeing how long it takes a lamb to stand up. But yeah, it's definitely possible.
Okay, very good, Áine. And just back, I'm conscious of time, but I'll hop back to yourself, Ben. And Willie asks a question there. I'll take you back to the genetic element, I suppose, of the condition. Is it possible, do you think, to identify the gene that causes laryngeal chondritis, or has there any research been done on that?
Well, that is the question, isn't it? That's the $7 million question. And that is the aim of the next, 5 or 10 years, I think. I have been talking to a fellow who's researching the incidence of brachycephalic airway syndrome in dogs. And he's researching the genetic influence on skull shape and long soft palates and that sort of thing. And he's getting somewhere, even though it's likely to be not one single gene, just a sort of combination of genes and risky genes and non-risky genes and all that sort of stuff. But for my money, and interestingly, he also suspects an underlying connective tissue disorder, which might be something to do with the vocal folds and how close they are together and how much the curtains sort of hit each other when the thing breathes. So we should be able to work together with other people in other fields researching similar questions of conformation and things to get to a genetic basis, or at least to select some genes, hopefully, which don't impact on the other beneficial traits of the Texel, but do reduce the incidence of Texel throat. So personally, I think that's going to be the most promising line of inquiry, and I suspect there will be genetic problems, genetic traits to target,
Very good. That's one of the ways forward. So, and just maybe finally to ask you a sort of a technical question, that in terms of a post-mortem, do you find that the diaphragm has ruptured because of their excessive breathing? Is that the case? Does the diaphragm
I suspect
rupture?
that's probably most likely. Yeah, I think that's probably why. Yeah, I do think that's probably more likely, unless there's some underlying problem which we haven't figured out yet. But until proven otherwise, yes, I think it's just a mechanical rupture after years, a long lot of pressure, sustained pressure.
Okay.
Can I just answer the question about the paper that was quoted, Edmonds, Finch, Roden and McEwen, where they had a lower incidence of laryngeal chondritis in the 8,000 sheep that they looked at? I just looked up that paper, and we had obviously found it when we did our thing. I suspect that it says here, diagnosis of laryngeal chondritis was based on clinical signs in the animal immediately prior to death, and performed either by a veterinary surgeon and in her absence by the head shepherd. But not all cases were confirmed by a post-mortem examination. So it is possible that the incidence might have been underestimated by that study. And it's also possible that on those 4 farms, the within farm prevalence might have been low, but the between farm prevalence and the general prevalence in the population still might be higher than they estimated. And I can only speak as I find, and I see quite a lot of it, and I think it probably does reduce longevity in, as an average overall the breed, and we'd be better off without it, assuming we can retain all the beneficial traits too.
Okay, listen, and thank you, Ben, for picking up on that question. There's just so many of them coming in. I'm finding it difficult to keep on top of them. And as I said, we will endeavour to answer any. We will go through the questions and endeavour to answer them privately afterwards, and publish the questions on our website. So look, I'm conscious of time. Time is pushing on. So on behalf of myself and my colleagues on the conference organising committee, I would just like to thank our panellists for this evening, Áine O'Brien and Ben Shrugnal. Thanks very much, guys. And also to Nicola Featherstone and Paul Kenyon, our speakers from the first part of the conference. Also thank you to our director, Professor Jerry Boyle, for opening the proceedings and for his continued support of the sheep programme. A shout out also to our colleagues in the PR department, as well as our colleagues in the advisory regions, for their help in advertising and promoting this event. Special thanks to our online media specialist, Declan McArdle, for overseeing the live broadcasting of the conference on both nights. To yourselves, the viewers, thank you for tuning in such numbers on both nights, and also for your interaction with questions and comments. We hope you found the conference informative, and most importantly, I suppose, that there are some key messages you can take from the papers and use them to your advantage on your own sheep enterprise. If we didn't get to all the questions, as I said, we will endeavour to respond to them and post the answers up on our website. Also on our website, www.teagasc.ie, you will be able to view the recordings. That was a question that came in earlier on, of both webinars, as well as a text version of the 4 papers that we've presented. Just to flag that our National Hill Sheep Conference this year will also be taking place virtually in the same format as we've had this week. And that's on the 17th and 18th of February. And we'll have more details to follow on our website and our social media channels. Normally, I suppose at the close of our conference, I would be inviting you to join us for a cup of tea, some refreshments and a chat. It will have to be a virtual cuppa this year, but I suppose we look forward to the time that hopefully in the not too distant future that we will be meeting you all again in person at conferences, on-farm events and open days. So with that, I will draw our inaugural virtual National Sheep Conference to a close. Good night, everybody, and keep safe.